הייתי רוצה לפתוח את הערב הזה לזכרו של איתן ברגלס, פרופסור איתן ברגלס, בני משפחת ברגלס ותלמידי הפקולטה לכלכלה על שמו, אורחות ואורחים יקרים. ניתן לי הכבוד לומר מספר מילים הערב בטרם ירצה בפניכם פרופסור מילגרם את ההרצאה השנתית לזכרו של פרופסור איתן ברגלס. פרופסור ברגלס היה איש אקדמיה משכמו ומעלה, הוא היה כלכלן מבריק, איש מחקר מעמיק ומרחיק ראות. עבודתו של איתן מתועדת במחקריו הרבים, אשר פורסמו בכתבי העת החשובים ביותר וממשיכים להפרות סטודנטים וחוקרים ברחבי העולם. מרצו של איתן לא הוגבל לעיסוקו האקדמי, הוא שילב אותו עם עשייה נמרצת בתחומי החברה והכלכלה. אחרי סיום לימודי הדוקטורט הוא בחר לא לשוב מיד לאקדמיה, אלא לשמש כיועץ הכלכלי לממשלה במשך 3 שנים. ב-1978 הוא יצא לגיחה נוספת מהאקדמיה וכיהן במקום שבו אני התחלתי את דרכי כממונה על התקציבים במשרד האוצר. הוא היה שם 2 שנתיים. איתן היה חבר במועצות מנהלים של חברות גדולות במשק. לאורך השנים הוא שירת במספר ועדות ציבוריות, ביניהם ועדת בן שחר בנושא רפורמה במס, ועדה בנושא השכר במגזר הציבורי שבראשה הוא עמד. לאורך כל הקריירה שלו הוא הקפיד לקדם את טיפוח ההשכלה הגבוהה בישראל, ואף ישב כחבר בוועדה למימון ההשכלה הגבוהה. אנו בבנק הפועלים מיטיבים לזכור אותו כיושב ראש מועצת המנהלים של בנק הפועלים. בפנתיאון של הבנק שמור מקום של כבוד וגעגוע לזכרו של היושב ראש ברגלס, וחותמו ניכר בבנק עד היום. כיושב ראש בנק הפועלים היום, אני סבור שעלינו לקחת דף מספר חייו של איתן. אני סבור כי עלינו לחזק את הקשר בין התחום הציבורי, האקדמי והעסקי. משעה שהתמניתי לתפקידי, שמתי לי למטרה לחזק את תחום החינוך בישראל. תחום בו אנו פועלים כבנק במספר מישורים, כולל חיזוק הקשר בין הבנק והאקדמיה. רק לפני שעות מועטות ישבו 100 בכירים של בנק הפועלים כאן באוניברסיטת תל אביב, והשתתפו בסדנה על ניהול בתנאי אי-ודאות. ואפרופו חוסר ודאות, בימים האחרונים מצאתי עצמי מערער באיתן ותקופת כהונתו בבנק הפועלים. חשבתי על השנים הסוערות שעברה הכלכלה בין 85 ל-92, שנים של שינוי מתוכנית העיצוב לתחילת ההפרטה. כיושב ראש בנק הפועלים התמודד איתן יחד עם אמירם סיוון, הם עבדו מאוד צמוד ביחד, עם לא מעט משברים. עם משבר מיסות מניות הבנקים, ההשלכות שלו, עם ועדת בייסקי, עם משבר האשראי למגזר החקלאי, שאולי היה הנושא המרכזי ביותר אז, ועוד. שנת 2011 מחדדת עבורנו את ההכרה כמה מורכבת ורבת משתנים המציאות בה אנחנו חיים. שנה זו גם היא החלה בסימן של יציבות והתאוששות מקרו-כלכלית, אולם עוד לא עברנו את הרבעון הראשון, ואנחנו מוצאים את עצמנו עדים לשורה של תמורות גיאופוליטיות עמוקות באזורנו, אשר העלו את מחירי הקומודיטיז, העלו את פרמיות הסיכון בעולם, מהווים רוח נגדית לתהליך ההתאוששות הגלובלי. כך גם פגעי הטבע האדירים ביפן, אשר הלם בכלכלה השלישית בגודלה בעולם. כל אלו מחדדים את אלמנט אי-הוודאות איתו אנחנו מתמודדים. אבל תמיד התמודדו מנהלים עם סיטואציות כאלו, גם מנהלים וגם אקדמיים כאחד. נכון עשו חברי סגל החוג לכלכלה כאן, כאשר קבעו שהדרך הנכונה ביותר להנצחת זכרו הינה קיום ערב עיון שנתי כמו זה שאנו מקיימים כאן הערב, בו אנו מארחים מדי שנה אנשי אקדמיה מן השורה הראשונה בעולם. בהם ניתן לראות ממשיכי דרך למצוינות. אנו בבנק רואים זכות גדולה להיות שותפים למפעל יפה זה. עכשיו אני אבקש ממך, פרופסור וראש החוג כאן, פרופסור צבי נאמן, בעצם הייתי אומר להתחיל את הטקס.
It is a pleasure to introduce Professor Paul Milgrom from Stanford University as tonight's speaker in the Berglas Memorial Lecture. Professor Milgrom has made path-breaking contributions in economics in a remarkably wide range of subjects that include auction theory, market design, incentive theory, industrial economics, economic history, economics of manufacturing, economics of organizations, and game theory. What is more remarkable is that these contributions span the entire range from the most practical, and I do mean really practical as in the design and implementation of auction formats that are used throughout the world, to the most abstract. And we will see an example of this I believe we will see an example of this most abstract work in tomorrow's workshop in economic theory. I sometimes refer jokingly to the line in front of the Nobel Prize in economics, and I think it's not an exaggeration to say that Professor Milgrom occupies the best or the front place in that line. Professor Milgrom, please.
Well, how do we do this? Thank you for that lovely introduction, and thank you all for inviting me here. It's a real pleasure to be here. I was daunted, actually, when I was asked to give this lecture. I'm told that it's a public lecture, so it's supposed to be accessible to a wide audience, although I gather from some of the remarks beforehand that not all of the lectures have been accessible to a wide audience. And on the other hand, I was told that the audience would be dominated by professional economists who would expect me to adhere to those standards. So it's a challenging lecture to give. And at the same time, you've already been told about Professor Berglas. You all know about Professor Berglas. In thinking about this, when I was invited to give this lecture, I thought about, what do I need to talk about here? This is a man who, on the one hand, chaired at the Bank Hapoalim, chaired the board of directors, and on the other hand was an advisor and a researcher. How could I create a lecture that would honor such a man? So what I've decided to do is to give you a talk that is accessible. It's going to start by talking about bidding strategy and some work that I did in advising a very successful bidder in a very large radio spectrum auction, a bidder who spent $2.4 billion in a radio spectrum auction in the United States. And I'm going to talk to you about what went into creating a strategy for that bidder and what lessons we learned from that. And then some theorizing that I did following that. It turned out that perhaps the most important thing to understand is that the role of budgets played in deciding how to bid in an auction. It turns out most of economic theory that studies auctions focuses on the value bidders have, how much something is worth, and not on how much money they have available. And as you're going to see for auctions like this, that's a big mistake. The budgets are extremely important in understanding and forming strategy for these auctions. And after doing the theory, one of the other things I did was design some new kinds of auctions and design and implement them, and I'll tell you a little bit about that toward the end of the talk, depending on how time goes. Let's see, it's 6:25, and I believe I have about an hour and a quarter to speak, so let's see how this goes. So first I'm going to tell you about a particular auction in the U.S., a very concrete example. This is auction 66, which took place in 2006. It was a very large auction. It had 168 bidders that were participating in the auction. There were 1,132 radio spectrum licenses for sale in this auction. The total of the winning bids was in excess of $14 billion US. So this was a very large and important auction. The story I'm going to tell you really is a story of two potential entrants. In the United States at the time there were four major wireless telephone companies and a couple of big regional players. But there were two new entrants who wished to acquire spectrum to provide new kinds of services. And the two entrants were, first of all, a company called Wireless DBS, which was really a consortium of the major satellite television companies. These companies did not prepare adequately for the auction, as I hope to show you. They ended up acquiring nothing, and they ended up complaining to the Federal Communication Commission after the auction that the rules were biased against new entry. The other big potential entrant was Spectrum Co., which was a consortium led by Comcast and with Time Warner and Bright House, Newhouse. It was a consortium of cable television companies that ended up achieving nationwide entry. That is, they acquired radio spectrum licenses in every major urban area. They paid a lot less than the average. This was all spectrum in the same band, so this is all apples to apples comparison. They paid a lot less than anybody else for comparable spectrum. In fact, their average price was about 33% less than the average of the other major bidders, saving them about $1.2 billion in comparison to what the other bidders did. And I want to talk to you about the strategy that accomplished that and what lessons we learn, what it teaches us in terms of theorizing, and how we incorporate those lessons in designing new kinds of auctions. So first of all, what did Spectrum Co. accomplish? This is a map. What's shown in red are the licenses that Spectrum Co., the cable television companies, acquired in the Spectrum auction. You can see it's pretty much where the people are. They didn't acquire licenses in West Texas, and they didn't acquire licenses in Wyoming and in some of the less populous states. They were interested in acquiring licenses covering the major metropolitan areas on the east coast of the United States, the west coast, Chicago, Detroit, those sorts of areas. And they covered all this covered over 92% of the US population. 20 megahertz of bandwidth of radio spectrum was acquired. The price comparison that I spoke of, these are all the bidders in the auction. There were 5 that spent $1 billion or more acquiring a radio spectrum in this auction. Spectrum Co.'s at the top. Their average price per megahertz pop, that's a unit. I'll explain these units to you a little later, but for now, just take my word. This is an appropriate unit for measuring how much coverage you bought. They paid 45 cents per megahertz pop in this auction. Singular, which was an independent company at the time, paid 55 cents. T-Mobile, 63 cents. Verizon, 73 cents. Metro PCS, 96 cents. The other 4 largest taken together paid about 68 cents per megahertz pop. And by comparison, what's shown in the right-hand columns is how much money the Spectrum Co. saved if it had paid any of these other higher prices. It's on average nearly $1.2 billion in savings from paying less for the same thing, that is for radio spectrum coverage covering the United States. Okay, so that's what was accomplished. What was the challenges that they faced? What was the auction about? That's what I want to begin by telling you about. So this is a background for the auction. So the spectrum licenses are sold in the following way in the United States. First of all, the spectrum is cut into chunks, frequency bands, and then it's also divided according to the geographic areas that those frequency bands cover. So you might have a 20 megahertz frequency band covering, let's say, the New York region, and a rough measure of the quantity that's involved, the way we rule of thumb measurement of quantity for that is you multiply the amount of bandwidth times the population that's covered to determine a quantity. So if you cover an area of 10 million people with 20 megahertz of bandwidth, that's considered to be 200 million megahertz pops. That's a description of how much bandwidth covering how many people is done in the auction. Now, the geographic coverage in the US is divided up in a variety of different ways, all of which were for sale at the same time in this auction. They're so-called cellular market areas. There are 734 of those in the United States. They exist for historical reasons. When the cellular telephones were first brought into existence in the early to mid-'80s, the regions that were set up, cellular telephones were thought to be a local telephone device, and the areas that were set up were all these little local areas. There were 734 of them in the United States. Those were the original market areas. The larger areas are called economic areas or regional economic area groupings. And just to give you an idea of what they look like, these are the cellular market areas. There are 734 of them again. Small areas covering different parts of the United States. They're larger where there's very few people. but they tend to be small where the populations are concentrated. Okay? There are, these are the economic areas. There are 176 of these, and again, these are considerably larger than the cellular market areas. And finally, there are the regional economic area groups. There's a Great Lakes region, a Mississippi Valley region, Northeast, Southeast, and so on. These are, there are 5 of them covering, or rather 6 of them covering the mainland US, and 6 more covering smaller areas, for example, one covering Alaska, the Gulf of Mexico, Hawaii, and so on. Okay. So the auction, which had, as I've already said, 168 bidders and 1,132 radio spectrum licenses, was offering 90 megahertz of bandwidth in what's more or less the 3G, what's called the 3G spectrum, that is mostly around the 2 gigahertz frequency band. The bands were broken into 6 units, so the frequencies were divided into 6 areas, 6 frequency bands covering the whole 90 megahertz. 3 of them were 20 megahertz band. That's the amount of bandwidth that was being sold. And those, one of those was broken into regional economic area groups, 1 into economic areas, and 1 into cellular market areas. And then there were 3 10 megahertz bands. So less bandwidth, half the bandwidth, but 2 of those covered regional economic area groups, and one of those bands was for economic areas. So you put these all together, you have divided by area, divided by bandwidth, you have 1,132 licenses. Okay, so it's a complicated auction. Okay, what were the rules? So this is an open ascending auctions going on simultaneously for many items. All of these items are being sold at the same time in ascending auctions, with software being used to track what's going on in the different auctions. They're connected. They're connected by what's called an activity rule that Bob Wilson and I designed in 1993. And the way these activity rules work is they measure the quantity of spectrum that you're bidding on using this megahertz pop measure. And they restrict bidders from increasing the quantity that they demand during the course of the auction. This is to encourage bidders to be active early in the auction and not just wait around and withhold their demands. The idea is to get some idea about prices during the auction before you have to make your final bids. So that was the gist of how this worked. And in Auction 66, one important effect that the activity rule had is it made it easy to switch in bidding from large licenses to small licenses. If you were outbid for a license that had 200 million quantity units associated with it, it was easy to use that eligibility to bid for licenses that had 50 million associated with it. It was hard to switch from bidding on smaller licenses to larger licenses, or harder to make such a switch. So at the beginning of Auction 66, here are the strategy challenges that a real bidder faced. Okay, there are really 2 big ones. For all the bidders, there was the switching challenge. So there was the question of when to stop bidding on the large licenses and start bidding on the small licenses, because it was going to be hard to switch back bidding the other way. And for a new entrant, and this was what was particularly interesting for us, there was something called the exposure problem. This is something that's gotten a lot of attention among economic theorists. The basic idea of the exposure problem is that if you're a company like Comcast and you are trying to establish a business covering the entire country, and you have to do it by buying lots of individual pieces, you've got a decision point at some time is whether to continue bidding or not. You don't want to get stuck with licenses covering the Great Lakes area and the Midwest and the Mississippi Valley if you can't afford to buy licenses covering New York and Los Angeles. It makes no sense as a business plan. And that makes bidding in this auction hard because you have to stay active during the auction, and as prices rise in places that you have not yet acquired licenses, you could find that you already have made a bid that doesn't get topped in the Mississippi Valley, in the Midwest, and not be able to make winning bids on the coasts where the population density is greatest. So that was the challenge, and this challenge, according to the literature at the time, and in fact according to much of the literature that still exists, is supposedly impossible to solve. The danger of dropping out too late is that a bidder may win scattered licenses of little business use. Okay, so that was the challenge that that the cable television companies faced in trying to plan entry in this auction. Okay, now the first thing you want to do when you form strategy is get your facts right to make sure that you understand how this auction proceeds. And we looked at the other largest auctions in the past to see what kinds of patterns of bidding we might expect and to see how we could forecast how this auction would play out. And historically, in all previous large auctions in the United States, it was the biggest licenses, the ones covering the most people, that attracted the most early interest. Most of the early bidding was on the biggest licenses. Some bidders later switched to smaller licenses, and a consequence of this pattern is that there was imperfect arbitrage among the licenses. Sometimes the licenses of different sizes covering the same areas had different prices. So in particular, the historical pattern as of 2006 was that larger licenses tended to sell for lower prices than smaller licenses. Okay, that had been the historical pattern. People theorized about that. Some of them said, well, only the big companies can afford to bid on the big licenses, so there's more demand for the small licenses. They told stories of that sort, but as we'll see, those stories were wrong. Okay, this auction 35 was at the time the largest auction that the US had ever run, and we looked at, this is a typical example of pattern of bidding. These two curves that are shown here, they add up to 100%. There's one is just 100% minus the other. What these show you is that for licenses that are above average in size and licenses that, let's see, is this oh, it is a laser pointer here, good. So for licenses that are above average in size, this is the percentage of business activity by round in the auction on the percentage of bidding activity on those licenses. And for licenses that are below the median in size, that's the percentage of bidding activity. And you can see that most of the bidding activity early in the auction, 70% or so, is on the, over here is on the largest licenses. It trails off till late in the auction. All of the activity is focused on the smaller licenses. Okay, that's a pattern that we had seen. And to tell the same story in another way, these are the rounds at which the last bid was made for some license. So the largest licenses, this is a log scale that shows you the size of the licenses. The largest licenses over here tended to get their last bids early in the auction. There was an exception. There was a flurry of activity at the end, late in the auction on New York City licenses. But for the most part, most of the bidding occurred early on the big licenses. And the licenses that finished late in the auction were all smaller licenses. Okay, so this was the empirical pattern that we faced in trying to form a strategy. This is really, problematic that the licenses are not closing together. You have to decide: are we going to bid for big licenses or small licenses? How are we going to try to assemble this this package? Now you might think, well, it can't be that hard. After all, if you have some idea what the prices are, you know whether you're going to be able to afford licenses in the auction. How much uncertainty is there, after all, about what license prices are going to be like? Turns out there's quite a lot, actually. In the absence of uncertainty, this would be easy, but there's actually a lot of uncertainty. This gives you some idea of how much. These are previous radio spectrum auctions for spectrum that's used for mobile handsets. And these are the prices that had been in these auctions. You can see that the price per unit varies enormously among these auctions. One could argue that these two green ones are different. They should be more valuable spectrum. But you can see the price per megahertz pop varying from a low of 20 cents to a high of $4.37. And in fact, over relatively short periods of time, there was just a lot of variation in how high the prices went in these auctions. So just on the historical basis, there was a lot of uncertainty. And if you looked at analyst estimates, the analyst estimates for auction 66 The analyst's estimate of the total revenue of the auction ranged from 7 billion to 15 billion, which is still more than 2-to-1 uncertainty. And if you look back historically, the analysts were often wrong. That is, it was not uncommon for the prices to fall outside the range of the analysts' estimates. So a lot of uncertainty entering this auction as to how high the prices would be, and you have important decisions to make, billions of dollars to commit in deciding what you're going to do when you bid in this auction. Okay, so that's the that was the problem that Comcast faced in entering auction 66. Okay, so I want to talk to you about budgets, which had been largely neglected in the economic literature. Not completely. There's a few important papers about this, but the it's going to turn out that we can say a lot about, and we can understand a lot about the bidding that went on in this auction by understanding that in these very large spectrum auctions, the bidders are budget constrained. Okay, and the way the initial evidence I'll give you for that is to just think about for a moment the way you normally think about an ascending auction. So you have an auction, you've got, let's say, only one license for sale, the way you usually think about these things. Suppose you have 3 bidders that have maximum prices of 100 and 90 and 70. And you have an ascending auction. Prices are rising gradually in the auction. 3 bidders stay active until the price gets to around 70. And at that point, the total amount of budget that's being exposed, you have 3 bidders who are bidding, and you can see budget being exposed of around 210. 3 bidders active at a price of around 70. Then one of the bidders drops out, and the price rises to about 90, and there's still about 180 units of budget exposed. And then that bidder drops out, and there's 90 units of budget exposed, and the auction is over. What would happen if this is what was going on in the auction? You'd see quite a large ratio between the total amount of budget exposed and the price. In this case, 210 divided by 90 is 233%. So you'd see a lot of unspent budget that goes home at the end of the auction. The extreme alternative that you might imagine in an auction with many items for sale is that bidders just spend what they have available. They go out and there's a lot of things to buy. They spend their whole budgets and they buy what they can. Okay? And if that were the correct theory of how bidders were behaving, the maximum exposure ratio would be 1. Take a look at what the highest budget you see available in the auction. That's how much gets spent in the auction. Okay? Which of these describes what we actually see? Well, this is auction 35, which again was the previous largest US radio spectrum auction. And what's interesting about auction 35 is this is the exposure that we calculated, taking a look at all the bids bidders made, where we're estimating how much money they have available to spend from the most they ever bid. And it rises fairly quickly into the $17 billion range, and then stays more or less in that range. There's a lot of wiggles in here, but stays more or less in that range. And it rises to that point while prices are still under $5 billion. A lot of bidders. And prices continue to rise and rise and rise until they get up to about $17 billion. And that's how much gets spent in the auction. So if this were the right theory of how bidders behave, we would have a great leading indicator in this auction of where prices were going. We could just take a look at the total amount of budget that was being spent, and that would be a leading indicator of the total price in the auction. That's great from the standpoint of planning strategy, right? You know in advance where the prices are going. Here's some details. So if you want to know whether this is a theory that describes how the individual bidders are actually behaving, well, it doesn't really. There's a lot of fluctuations in there, and let's see what's really going on. So what I have here is bidder by bidder. We've tracked how the bidders are bidding. And you can see actually that for, here's AT&T, for example, the red line. They bid up to about, $3 billion or so, and early in the auction, and then that's, roughly speaking, subject to some fluctuations, that's what they end up spending. Here, the light blue line, I've forgotten, that's singular, and they have a similar pattern. Here, this heavy blue line, well, I can't quite read all of these things from here. That was a video stream, it looks like here. They bid up to this level, and again, they flatlined. So you can see what these bidders are doing is they're bidding up to some budget limit and then flattening out. For most of them, now there are exceptions here. Here's a bidder where the prices went up and this bidder dropped out of the auction. So it had a lot of money on the table, and then it decided not to spend anything. And here's another one. The gold line is a bidder who put a lot of money on the table and then decided it couldn't get what it wanted, so it mostly dropped out of the auction. So this theory is not an exact description of what's going on here, but it gives us a pretty decent indicator of what the incumbent bidders are doing. Pretty much for all the incumbent bidders except Verizon, which doesn't seem to have any budget limits at all. Verizon seems to just get out there and buy what it wants by spending what it needs. With the exception of Verizon here, for the most part, these bidders the incumbent bidders are spending their budgets. Okay, so we went back and took a look at all of the major U.S. spectrum auctions that were, so these are, again, this is a log scale, so the big auctions are out here, and looked at what the maximum, what the revenue was from the auction and what the maximum exposure is from the auction. If the budget theory were exactly right, these dots would all lie on the 45-degree line. And the 45-degree line didn't do too well for auction 37 or for auction 33 over here, but for the most part, it provided a pretty good description of what was going on in the auction. The maximum exposure in the auction was pretty much the final price in the auction. Okay? Well, that was great. Okay, so we were very excited to discover this because if you have a good early price indicator, the switching problem is solved for you. You can decide, you can just avoid bidding for licenses that are too expensive. If you can forecast what too expensive is, what the average price is going to be in the auction, you stop bidding on licenses when their prices get above average. And in terms of the exposure problem, a good early price forecast enables an entrant to assess whether it can acquire a good package, that is a collection of licenses that supports a real business, at an acceptable cost. And if it doesn't, and if you can identify this early, you can just, if you can't afford it, you drop out of the auction. So that was the core of the strategic analysis that we did. Okay, I'm cooking here. I'm going pretty fast, so I hope you guys are all with me. Okay, so this is what actually happened in auction 66. We were tickled, of course, that we got exactly the pattern that we expected and hoped for. The exposure gave us a really early indicator when prices were still at a fraction of their final level. We were forecasting prices that turned out to be accurate in terms of what the final prices were going to be in the auction, and we used that forecast as an important guide in our decision making. Okay, so again, the actual pattern which we put together after the end of the auction shows pretty much what you'd expect. For the most part, these bidders bid up to a budget and then flattened out. This one that's jumping all over the place, that's us. We decided we didn't want people to be able to forecast our budget in case they were looking at the same data we were looking at. So we were intentionally trying not to fit the pattern. But apart from us, most of these bidders do. There's a few exceptions here that are of some interest. So our competitors, remember this is the cable television companies. Their big competitors are the satellite television companies. And the satellite television companies are driven out of the auction at this point. They bid up and they get confused and they drop out at around round 13 of the auction. And let's see, in New York, Cablevision, which is the Dolan family, bid for some big licenses in New York. When it couldn't afford them, it bid for some smaller licenses in New York. When it couldn't afford those, it dropped out entirely. But most of the other bidders have patterns that followed roughly what we had forecast. Okay, so we were able to guess pretty early in the auction how much each of the bidders was going to spend. Now, This picture is almost magical. This was, you don't expect theories to work quite this well, but what we did at Comcast is, here's the exposure curve, and here is the, I'm sorry, the two curves I'm showing you here are the prices for the large licenses and the prices for the smaller licenses, the average price normalized on a per unit basis. You can see that the smaller licenses ended up being much cheaper per unit than the larger licenses. The cheap way to get national coverage was to buy a bunch of little licenses and pack them together rather than buying a bunch of big licenses. Okay? That's how the auction turned out. And the crossing point occurred right here around round 13, where the average price of the large licenses became larger than the average price that would eventually prevail for the smaller licenses. And this dotted line here is the round at which Comcast switched from bidding from larger licenses for smaller licenses. Turns out that the forecasts worked out uncannily well. We switched at exactly the point where the large licenses became more expensive than the final average price. So this accounts to a large degree for the success that Comcast had. It left the other bidders stuck with the expensive licenses as their prices continued to rise, and it switched to bidding for the smaller licenses and covering the United States with a bunch of smaller licenses. Okay. Now, this is real money that's on the table. My client spent $2.4 billion, and they liked this analysis, but they weren't satisfied with it. What if your forecast is wrong? Okay, it has been wrong in some previous auctions. Auction 37, it didn't work very well at all. It's worked pretty well in most of these auctions, but what if the forecast is wrong? What else can we do? So this is one of the most exciting things that happened in this particular auction, where we get to talk a little bit more about the strategy of playing real high-stakes games. So this forecasting solution's never been used before, right? It's novel, it's unproven, the data look good, but we're putting X billion dollars at risk. They ended up spending $2.4 billion in this auction. What if your forecast is wrong, or what if it comes too late to be useful? Okay, what then? So it was back to the drawing board to figure out what else we could do. And the exposure problem in this auction looks actually even more severe than the general theory would tell you. If you take a look at the way the US set up this auction, the basic structure was this. They decided that they would set the initial prices of each of the spectrum licenses at an amount that was basically 5 cents per megahertz pop. They set the same price per unit for every license, and then they let the auction proceed, and bidders continued to bid on all the licenses. So all the license prices were rising, but they were all selling for roughly the same price per unit among the large licenses throughout the early part of the auction. Now that's really dangerous, because we know that in fact the prices are going to clear at a lower price per unit in the areas where spectrum is plentiful, that is where the population is less dense. They're going to be much more expensive, probably twice as expensive historically, in places where the population is more dense. That is, they're going to be expensive in Los Angeles and New York, and they're going to be cheap in the Mississippi Valley and the mountain states. But what's going to happen in this auction, if things proceed in the normal way, is that the prices are going to reach market clearing in the Mississippi Valley and in the mountain states before we know what the prices are going to be on the West Coast and on the East Coast. That's a big problem for a company that needs to acquire coverage in all the major metropolitan areas in order to decide what to do. It's going to have to commit first on the smaller licenses. So that was the other problem we faced. And the nightmare scenario for us was that both the satellite television companies and the cable television companies would acquire licenses covering the mountain states and the Mississippi Valley, because those prices were fairly low and both of these companies wanted to achieve national entry. But when we got to the East Coast and the West Coast, there'd only be room for one. there would for sure be somebody who was going to get stuck with a nonsensical collection of licenses. That was the nightmare scenario because that meant that the competition would be intense and we might be the loser. Okay, so that's the scenario we were worried about in this setting. Okay.
When you say we, you're talking from the point of view of a particular bidder, like Comcast, or are you talking
Comcast, yes.
advisor of the system?
I was advising Comcast in this auction, Comcast and the consortium of cable television companies. So when we were forecasting what was dangerous for a bidder, the exposure problem, the possibility that we might end up with a useless collection of, from a business point of view, of licenses, this is the danger. This danger was amplified by the presence of another entrant with room for two entrants where the spectrum is plentiful and no room for the entrants where the spectrum is scarce. Okay? So we did something else that was really exciting. In fact, I have to, since I have time, I should tell this story. By the way, the other advisors, I didn't advise this alone. I was working with the economists out there will know Jeremy Bulow and John Levin, who are both also professors at Stanford University. It was the three of us who were on the team figuring out this strategy. And we had to decide what to do. What could we do that would help provide some security for our client? And we chose a tactic that was unprecedented in U.S. spectrum auctions. It was something that we planned to execute at round 9 of the auction and did execute at round 9 of the auction. It was a jump bid, the largest jump bid in the history of the U.S. radio spectrum auctions, a $750 million jump bid. This was a bid that doubled the prices for the big licenses covering the Northeast and the West, raising them from $750 million to $1.5 billion. Okay, and so I need to tell you what we were thinking when we did this and what the purpose of this tactic was. Okay, and the purpose of this tactic was actually mixed. This is one of the things that we don't often see in our economic models. This tactic really had multiple objectives and multiple rationales. Part of the rationale is that the prices are misaligned. We do not want the markets to clear first in the mountain states in the Mississippi Valley. We want the prices to rise first on the coast so we know whether we can afford entry on the coast before we have to commit in the mountain states in the Mississippi Valley. And we had an opportunity to make that happen by bringing the price ratios into alignment. It should be twice as expensive on the coasts as in the mountain states in the Mississippi Valley, so let's make it twice as expensive by making a jump bid. So now, a jump bid is not the only way to bring the prices into alignment. So this, but we did want to realign the prices generally throughout the auction in order to give ourselves more certainty about whether we were going to be able to afford licenses covering the two coasts. Okay, but there are more reasons. Oh, by the way, this doubling. Why doubling? So, doubling. First of all, historically, prices on the coast are more than twice the prices in the interior just because of spectrum scarcity. Second, doubling was the largest jump bid allowed under the rules of this auction. So we wanted, there's a certain strategic rationale to this. We don't want to signal weakness. We don't want our competitor to think we're on the verge of dropping out. And when somebody suggested, well, why don't we just raise the prices by 70%, the part of the discussion was, well, the competitor might think you were unwilling to go to 80. But doubling, when that's the largest jump bid allowed in the auction, nobody can make a negative inference from that kind of bid. So part of this was just to do the largest jump bid that was legal in the auction. The other thing is, oh, and by the way, $750 million is the largest jump bid that's ever been made in a U.S. radio spectrum auction. Before I tell you the rest of what we were doing, I have to tell you that since I have a little time and since this was so exciting, I'm just reliving it right now. As I remember the day we decided to do this, the three of us, John and Jeremy and I were speaking on the phone, and we decided we were going to recommend this to the client. And this jump bid was made on a Monday morning. We had for reasons that will become clear in a moment, we'd recommended to the client that they delay the rationalization of prices to Monday morning. We recommended this on Wednesday night. There were 2 more rounds of bidding on Thursday and 2 more rounds of bidding on Friday. And when I made this recommendation on behalf of the team on Wednesday night, the client said, well, I don't have to decide right away. Do I need to talk to the CEO? So we called the CEO, and they said, well, they wanted to talk to the chairman of the finance committee and the board of directors. This is a very large bid to make. So Thursday, I didn't hear anything. They said, well, it's Monday morning, right? We don't have to decide yet. Friday, I didn't hear anything. Nothing yet. Saturday, I didn't hear anything. Sunday night, I got a call from the head of the bidding team, and he said, we've decided to take your advice. You better be right. So this was very exciting for me. I'd never done anything quite like this move before. But I have to explain to you why we chose to do such a large bid and why we chose to do it on Monday morning. So, and the reason was our main competitor, the satellite television companies. Satellite television companies were bidding as though they didn't have a clue about the importance of budget constraints. They had money spread all over the place. And we had an estimate from the investment banks of how much budget they had available. And we knew that when we made this bid, suddenly raising the price on the coasts, they wouldn't have enough budget to match. Okay, so this was done to catch them by surprise. And it was done on a Monday morning because if it had been done on Friday afternoon, they could have taken the weekend to figure out what their response would be. Monday morning, we made this bid at 9 o'clock, and they had to make their next round bid at 11 a.m. They had 2 hours to respond. And we thought we might catch them with their pants down. And indeed, what happened is this was rounds 9, 10, 11, and 12 were run this day. We made this jump bid at round 9. At round 11, the satellite television companies stopped bidding. They had a budget in excess of $2 billion that was on the table that disappeared from the auction. That also nailed down our estimate of what the final prices in the auction would be at a number that was less than the budget that we had available, and basically established our success in this auction. Okay, this is our jump bid, taking us right up to here. This is wireless DBS seeing our jump bid, and they stopped bidding. They took their money home out of the auction. This is the point at which you can see our prices drop way down. Right here, we switched bidding from big licenses to bidding on small licenses, which ended up being the cheapest licenses in the auction, and we went home for all the strategic planning as the big winners in this auction. Okay. All right. So that was the first part of the talk. It's about strategy and about how we paid attention to what was going on, analyzed the historical data, and based a strategy on that was successful in an auction. By the way, I kept this stuff secret for 2 years and advised a client in the Canadian auction and in another auction that will go unnamed. The general budget forecasting strategy has continued to work over a period of years. It's very hard for these guys to get around the fact that they have budgets and they need to spend them. But that raises the question of how we should think about auction design, given that we know bidders have budget constraints. Okay, how should we be designing auctions in this case? And there are a lot of auctions that, from this standpoint, knowing that it's budgets rather than values that are driving bidding, there are a lot of auctions that are actually quite badly designed. So I want to tell you about oil lease bidding in the United States. Since the Bush administration came in 2000 and the Department of Interior in the United States expanded the lands that were available for auction, there's been a drastic fall in the average number of bidders per tract. Right now, the U.S. mineral right auctions have an average of 1.3 bidders per tract, and prices have crashed in those auctions. Okay? Most of the time when you're bidding in an auction, you're bidding alone. These are sealed bid auctions. You take a chance, you bid low. Most of the time, that wins. So we've had low auction prices. Many of these tracts in the U.S. are selling for have been selling for the reserve price. And it could be that we hypothesize that part of the reason for this is these tracts are expensive. The bidders might be budget constrained. What would we do if that were the right explanation? Okay, can we help that with auction design? So the hypothesis and the idea is that since it's losing bidders actually that set prices in auctions, or the threat of bids by the bidders that don't win, it's probably too risky for losers with limited budgets to bid for very many tracts. What if we provided a way to protect the losing bidders from overspending and allowed them to bid more aggressively on more tracts? Suppose that we created an auction in which, in addition to saying how much you bid for each of the item in a sealed bid auction, you also named an expenditure limit. And you say, I'm willing to pay X for this item, Y for that item, Z for this item, but I only have a budget B that I can spend in total. Okay? Can we design an auction like that? And would that encourage bidders to bid more? So here's where I go to the economists in here a little bit more. This is a very simple model of the situation I've described. I've got 3 tracts and 4 bidders. I've chosen an example with 3 tracts and 4 bidders because that gives you a participation of 1.33, which is pretty close to what the data shows for the average number of participants per tract. About the US experience. And I'm going to express the values and prices as net of any reserve, just to speak about how much above the reserve price bidders bid. So I'm going to suppose that bidders 1 to 3 are bidders who have nominated these 3 tracts, and they each bid for the tract they've nominated. They each have a value of 1 and a budget of 1 that's available to spend. This is just normalizing assumptions. Bidder 4 has some value that's probably less than 1, at least a third, but less than 1. But it can afford, because of the reserve price, to bid on just 1 tract. And these are simultaneous first price auctions. So this is just a really simple model of what might be going on in the US oil lease bidding. Okay? Turns out that if you solve this using the standard methods of game theory, there is a unique Nash equilibrium. It involves mixed strategies. Bidders randomize a little bit. You're not sure if bidder 4 is going to bid against you or somebody else. You don't want to be too predictable, but you bid pretty low if you're one of bidders 1 to 3. Bidders 1 to 3 each earn an expected profit of 2/3, and bidder 4 earns an amount that's V minus 1/3 at the unique Nash equilibrium of this game. Okay? Now, suppose we added expenditure limits. We said bidder 4, or any bidder for that matter, but in particular bidder 4, can put in bids for all the tracts, and it can also name an expenditure limit. Now that creates, intuitively, that creates more competition for all the bidders. Instead of there being just a 1 in 3 chance that you're going to have any competition, now all of you face competition. If you bid too low, bidder 4 could be bidding against you, and you basically are competing with the other bidders to keep bidder 4 away. What does that do to the equilibrium of the game? So the rules are that there are simultaneous sealed bids. Bidders may name an expenditure limit if they choose. The auctioneer, again, takes the highest bids, but it takes the set of bids that maximizes its revenue subject to these expenditure limits. So if there's no expenditure limits, these are the same rules as a standard sealed bid auction. But with an expenditure limit, it means that a bidder can afford to take a risk of bidding on multiple items even when it only wants to buy 1. If you do that, it turns out that bidders 1 to 3 at equilibrium bid bidder 4's value. This is the only equilibrium in which bidders play undominated strategies. And you end up with the bidders with the highest value winning, with all the prices higher, with the seller revenue better than for the original auction design. So the simple device of allowing a bidder to express a budget limit in addition to a bid in this context, according to a standard game theoretic analysis, raises the prices and improves the efficiency of the auction. Okay? All right, so What I want to tell you about next, and I'm actually coming close to the end of my talk here, so this is going very quickly. I'm on slide, 40-some already. Is thinking more about kinds of constraints that bidders might want to name in an auction. So this is based on a paper I published in 2009 in AEJ Micro, which on assignment messages and exchanges. And these are the motivating applications. I was talking with Pacific Gas and Electric in California about using an auction to buy, basically to buy electric power. It could buy power from different locations. It could buy power that originated in Southern California. It could buy power that originated in Northern California. It could buy power that was coming down through the California-Oregon border. And it had different transmission limits on how much power it could buy from the different locations, and also different transportation costs or transmission costs for carrying the power from those locations into its system. So it could substitute. It also was interested in possibly bidding as both a buyer and a seller. It thought that if it already owned power, it had contracts for power coming from Southern California, but it could buy it cheaper in Northern California. It would like a market in which it could sell the Southern California power and buy the Northern California power in the form of a swap. So they wanted to start with an auction and proceed eventually to a possible exchange. So that was, that was the Pacific Gas and Electric example. And the second example I was thinking about in developing this was Fonterra. Fonterra is the New Zealand milk cooperative. It's the largest milk producer in the world. It's a cooperative of all the New Zealand farmers, and they ship powdered milk out of New Zealand. And they have an auction every month. And they use an auction to sell whole milk powder with varying kinds of processing and times of delivery. So the kinds of problems that they had was they would have, for example, the ability to sell milk powder that's whole milk powder, ordinary whole milk powder, or it can be instantized so it dissolves more quickly, or it could be UHT milk, which is treated at ultra high temperature so that it lasts longer. So it could produce or sell any of those things, and they're subject to various production constraints and different costs of production. And they had buyers that were interested in the different kinds of milk. So they had a problem of substitution. They had a problem of integer allocations. That is, it turns out milk powder, the only cheap way to ship milk powder is by the container load. A container load is a very large amount of milk powder. And so many of the buyers needed the outcome of the auction to be whole numbers of units, which is not standard to think about in economic theory, although it's very common, of course, in practice. And they, too, were interested in eventually having an exchange in which there could be multiple sellers out of Australia, for example, also participating in the same market. So here's a simple numerical example to show you the kind of thing we had in mind. So PG&E might want to acquire 12 units of power. It might have transmission constraints that say it can take up to 10 units from the California-Oregon border, but no more because it doesn't have the capacity to transport more. It might be able to take up to 8 from Southern California. That's the SP15 node, or it was at the time. The nodes have been redefined subsequently. And it can take all 12 units if it wishes from Northern California. Transmission costs differ from these different network nodes. How would it run an auction? Okay, so this is another place where constraints come in handy in deciding an auction. So this is a practical insight that I used in the development of the theory. Substitution within feasible limits in a lot of real auction settings is actually 1-for-1 within feasible limits. And that happens when these things have characteristics like location of availability. So I can take a megawatt of power from here or from there, provided I have transmission capacity for it, or trucking capacity, or whatever it may be. Date of availability. If I have storage capacity for milk powder, I can take it a month early, or if I have, the date of availability can be something that if you have storage, you can you have 1-for-1 substitution up to your storage limits. Greater quality. If I'm making coffee and I'm buying coffee beans and I'm allowed to substitute coffee beans from Kenya for coffee beans from Rwanda, up to the formula limits that are set in my specifications for how the formula goes. These are all one-for-one rates of substitution for different commodities, and they're quite common in practical problems. Okay, various kinds of contract terms. Also, I can take it with high reliability. Or in Colombia, I'm talking to the Colombian government about the redesign of the electricity markets there. You can have firm contracts or interruptible contracts for electrical power or for natural gas. If you have a firm contract for the gas you need, then you don't need the interruptible contract. To the extent that the interruptible contract is a substitute, it's a one-for-one substitute. This is a very restrictive pattern of substitution that's not often been looked at among economists, and it allows us to design simple messages that auctions can use, simple ways of bidding for both auctions and double auctions. So here's actually the screenshot from the software that we have. I'm not going to try to run the software here. It's all available on the web. This is an example of a bid that is being made for, this is a seller's bid. So for this seller is seeking to sell up to 12 units in total. It can sell up to 10 from COB, 8 from NP15, 12 from SP15. These are the maximum prices for each of them. So it's a simple way of making an offer that allows substitution. And these offers, the constraints, I probably should have done this live. These constraints can be arranged together in trees. That is, you can have one constraint that is subsumed under another constraint. So here we have the July requirements that I've described for you before. And with the press of a button, with taking a number of bids and offers of this form, you can compute market equilibria for a market this way. The messages that I've shown you where you express bids in this form, it is a theorem that if you run the auction this way, the market clearing quantities will be integer quantities. So this is an unusual kind of theorem for an economic model. But if the demands have this structure, then the market clearing quantities are guaranteed to be integer quantities. And so we could run, for example, a market for Fonterra and get whole container loads, find market clearing prices and get whole container loads of milk powder being sold to each party. In the software here, there's something that this particular screenshot is not anybody's view. It's sort of an imaginary view that gives you an overview of the entire auction. So I have here a hypothetical buyer, Ben, who has made a number of bids. These are the bids that cleared. I have some hypothetical sellers, one called Gen 3 up here and one called Gen 2. And what you can see is that the bidder can tell by looking at the margin on its bid. So I can't see these things from here. I have to walk over here so that I can see what you're looking at. So Gen 2, for example, and I can't see it from here either. I guess this is a little bit light. Well, it looks like Gen 2 has bid 15 units and sold 15 units, and here the bid price was $56. The price from Northern California was $56.60, so this had a margin of 60 cents on it. And that's larger than the margin on the other, which in fact was negative. So the bidder always gets the bids filled that have the highest margins. It's fairly easy for a bidder looking at a screen like this to verify that they've gotten, in fact, what they're supposed to get at the market clearing prices. And for those of you who remember your basic economic theory, if everybody's getting what they're supposed to get at the market clearing prices and prices clear, then we are indeed at a competitive equilibrium. So this software calculates competitive equilibrium for these settings. Okay, so just a little advertisement here. The major properties is this software is supposed to be easy for bidders to use. They simply say how much they want and what constraints apply, and they can express their bids that way. If every participant reports one of these messages, which the theory calls an integer assignment messages, then there are prices and integer allocations of goods that clear all the markets. Goods are substitutes in reported supply and demand. In fact, the rates of substitution are everywhere either 0 or 1. There exist minimum and maximum market clearing price factors, so we need to, in selecting prices, so if you think about this as an auction, you have to decide whether it's the equivalent of an ascending auction that stops at the lowest possible prices, or the equivalent of a descending auction which stops at the highest possible market clearing prices. But these maximum and minimum market clearing price factors exist. And for the game theorists among you, these message restrictions that I've described do not introduce any additional Nash equilibria compared to the general Walrasian mechanism. That is, it's a theorem that no matter what the preferences, and by the way, the preferences can be misspecified, no matter, that is, the preferences don't have to be describable in this format. No matter what preferences the bidders actually have, if they play this game, there is nothing bad that can happen as an equilibrium that couldn't already happen in a standard market mechanism. So we're not introducing any possibilities of collusion that weren't already present in an ordinary market mechanism. Okay? So what I've tried to do for you today was to again, thinking of Eitan Berglas, who was a scholar and a businessman and an advisor, what I've tried to do for you is to incorporate a few elements of each of those to describe some practical bidding advice that we gave that was very successful to a particular bidder, to tell you a little bit about some theory that once you realize that budgets are important, you can begin to actually design constrained mechanisms that take account of budgets and work in the auctioneer's interest to lead to a better outcome. And I've also shown you on the basis of that theory how to account for some other constraints in some other real applications. And I actually have software that implements this stuff. If any of you have any references to give me, I'm selling this thing too. So to take it in a very applied direction. I should say about the theory that there are some converse properties as well. Max is maximal. This is the best you can do with this. If the bidders were allowed to introduce additional constraints, if we tried to make the bidding language more complicated, we wouldn't be able to guarantee that there are integer allocations. Any additional complexity would rule that out. And any additional complexity would rule out that goods were substitutes and would not leave us with this pattern of minimal and maximal market clearing prices. Okay, but I think for the public lecture, I'm not going to delve into that. That stuff is all in my 2009 AEJ micro paper. And that brings me to the end of my presentation. That it?
Going back to the beginning, Paul, I didn't understand. I understand that presumably you get the information about the budget constraints from some other source. You didn't mention, you mentioned in one case that you got it from the investment bankers, but that was a critical part.
Oh no! But the point of in the strategic part, the point is that we have a leading indicator here. The point is that even if you don't have that information, you can see the bids that are being made during the course of the auction. This curve is a leading indicator for that curve. At the point when we still have prices in the range of $2–3 billion in the total auction, the exposure has already been revealed to be in the neighborhood of $14 billion. So very early in the auction, when prices are still low enough for us to change what we're bidding on, we have an estimate of where the prices are going. We do it, the actual algorithm that we used is we said when you hit the first peak is what the rule of thumb we used is You don't know anything until the totals have peaked. When you hit your first peak, you make your first estimate. So our first estimate was right here. It was just north of $14 billion. And then, we sort of track this and have...
And related to that, how did you assess which licenses they're going to be using that budget for later, in the sense of whether they're going to be going for the big ones, the medium, or the small ones?
Didn't need to assess that. What we need to know is what the prices are. So we knew at this point in the auction that the current prices at this point in the auction of the large licenses were already above what the average price was going to be in the auction.
Based on the previous estimate of the...
No, based on the exposure. Yeah, based on the exposure, based on what we think. So we knew somewhere around here we had a $14 billion estimate when prices were way below their final levels. And as prices passed through our estimate of what the final prices were, we decided those are not the licenses we want to be winning. So we shifted to bidding on the smaller licenses, which were still very much cheaper at a time when nobody else was bidding on them. You can see what the relationship is here. So you can see this thing turn up because we switched. So this curves down because there's less bidding on these licenses, and then finally other people switch and this bidding picks up, but it never reaches the same level as the licenses we switched off. Yeah.
Just an informative question. In those spectrum auctions, is there a pre-specified amount of time that once one company gives an offer, then there is a specified, like you mentioned, 2.5 hours until the other one? Who decides what is this time interval?
So those rules are specified in advance. They're set by the auctioneer, and this auction was run in a series of rounds. In order to track all of the information, what would happen is at the end of each round, you'd get a report back about all the bids, and then there'd be a few hours till the next round. And the number of hours between rounds was controlled by the auctioneer.
Who is the auctioneer in this case?
In this case, it was the U.S. Federal Communications Commission.
And do you know what were their considerations in deciding that it's going to be X hours? 2.5?
Oh yeah, there was extensive consultation beforehand. They had a lot of these auctions have been run since the mid-1990s. In 1994, because bidders were inexperienced with this, the first auctions began with rounds of 1 full day per round for the first rounds, and then they went to 2 rounds a day. Then they went to 4 rounds a day, and then later, as the bidding dies down and there's less information to process, they make the rounds shorter. So they got up, as I think in the early auctions, they got as many as 6 rounds a day in. In these auctions, in this auction, for the first 8 rounds, they were run at 2 rounds a day, and then they were run at 4 rounds a day for the next many rounds.
Was this pattern known in advance, or did they change it according to whatever was happening?
No, they give the bidders notice. So they notified us that the first week they would be running 2 rounds a day the first 4 days of the auction, just to make sure there are no glitches, everybody's system's working, all the communicate. There are billions of dollars at stake. They don't want the auction to fail because some line is down somewhere or some bidder has some problem with its system. And then the second week they were going to 4 rounds a day, and that's when we waited to make our jump bid, because 4 rounds a day means 2 hours between rounds. 9 o'clock Monday morning, there's, our competitors got to make 3 more bids that day, and they're caught with their pants down.
They must be made within working hours, within days.
Yeah, well, they're mostly, right, but it's done by over the internet, so the working hours are not the same across the country, and you're expected to adapt. Yeah.
If you were advising the satellite that Monday morning, assuming that they knew that you were working for the other side, what would you advise them to do? And also, the other point, it seems that, is there an explanation for the gap in the final analysis between the red curve and the blue curve? Because this is a question you brought up in the beginning. And
this is a failure of arbitrage. This is these guys didn't know where the prices were going, and the history was that the red curve always finished above the blue curve. This is the first this is a reversal of pattern, which we were the only ones to pick up because we had a method of forecasting prices. In all the previous large auctions, the small licenses sold for more per unit than the large licenses. This is the first auction with this pattern, and we were the only ones to anticipate it.
And regarding the advising, what should they have done that Monday morning?
They waited. Monday morning, it was too late. They had their budgets committed. This is why I thought, assuming that we had the right estimate of their budget, it was already too late for them. The stories that we heard later, and I don't know what credence to give to these stories. I like to believe the stories I heard later, that the CEO asked the bidding team what was going on, and the bidding team didn't know, and he said, "We don't belong in this auction," and pulled them out. And if that's true, then our bid did exactly what it was supposed to do, which was, throw them into disarray. They faced a very hard problem because their budget was committed everywhere. They couldn't continue to bid on the coast if our estimate of their budget is right. It was too late. Yeah.
I don't really understand. When you made the jump, and you still made it to a price that you could expect that it would eventually get to that price.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
So why would they so committed? I mean, if you're taking not just one round, but like 10 rounds to go over the candidate, they would still be committed, right? I mean, why did it make the change? Why did it change the fact that it was instantly, and they maybe could expect that the price would rise in 7.
They, meaning Comcast, are you referring to?
Your opponents could have expected the price would get there in 10 rounds.
They might have. I don't really know what they expected. Remember, there's a lot of uncertainty about prices. We had our forecast already of where we thought prices were going, but we don't think, and I don't know what's going on in everybody else's head. I don't think they know where prices are going. And, there's a lot of uncertainty about where the prices are going to end up. And the point was they had budget committed. The bidding teams typically have an authorization limit. They typically are allowed to bid within limits. Those limits can be adjusted during the auction. But a bidding team has normally said, this is how much you can bid. Don't put more money on the table than this. This is all that's authorized. And we put their bidding team in a situation where it would be unable to answer our bid without going over its what appeared to be its authorized limit.
So maybe if the price would rise more slowly, they could have cut back and get.
They might have been able to do that and stop bidding on other licenses. Yeah. Yeah.
The auction is online. You have only 5 minutes to
If you have only 5 minutes.
5 minutes.
Well, this is every auction is different. I don't claim that this is a general strategy that we apply to all auctions. If you have only 5 minutes between rounds, you can't be looking at 1,132 radio spectrum licenses. I mean, that would be a different auction, and I'd have to look at the details to know what to say.
But he's a potential client of your
Oh, I see.
of your software. So.
I see. Thank you.
Okay.
All right, thanks.
Thank you very much for this fascinating lecture.
Okay, thank you.